So I'm going to jump right in and talk about what I've been kind of trying to think about as kind of my research program, which I call Algorithms in Practice, and give you an overview of my research and why I think it's really important to do qualitative studies of artificial intelligence and what we can learn from these qualitative studies. So I'm gonna share my PowerPoint, trying not to take too long doing it. Of course, now that I try to do it. Okay, so you guys should be able to see it, right? Okay, is it all good for everybody?
Yes, looks good. Looks like we're seeing the next slide. Yeah.
Oh yeah, right. So let's see. Okay. It's always like that. Okay, let me see. How do I do that? He says, of course, turned into like the meme where I'm just like, let me try to do this correctly. Okay, so one sec. It always has to be like that. Don't ask me why. Okay, so now let's see if this works better. Up, play from start. Okay, this should be better, right?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, so let me just move this to the side. Okay, all good. I'm gonna just close this completely up. Okay, all good. So algorithms in practice and what that means to do qualitative studies of big data and computational technologies. So let me start with a tiny bit of background. We live in an era of data, of metrics, of algorithms, of artificial intelligence. We hear these words day in, day out. Not a single day takes place without some kind of media headline, either praising the benefits that we as mankind are going to get from artificial intelligence, or more generally these days, some kind of scandal involving large technology companies and their kind of opaque, messy, biased AI systems that are affecting people in negative and unpredictable and unaccountable ways. Now, typically when we talk about data, big data, small data, all kinds of data, we see these kinds of images, which I think is just so interesting because, they always use the same kind of aesthetic styles, so there's a lot of blue, lots of numbers, lines of codes, like kind of network graphs. Often there is like the portrait of a human, often a white lady, looking kind of completely mesmerized by the kind of intelligence and completely in awe of like computational technologies and artificial intelligence. So this is part of the life world we live in, right? We live with these algorithmic systems. Now, while you're staring at these nice images, let me kind of start with a note about definition. I use the terms data, algorithms, analytics, and AI kind of together as socio-technical systems. That said, there are important differences between these terms. Data can be understood as some kind of information, usually digital, usually quantitative, that is collected and can be used for specific purposes. Algorithms are typically understood as procedures that turn this kind of input data into some kind of output. Again, often very complex procedures. For instance, that's the case with machine learning algorithms. Analytics and metrics refer to the quantitative output of these algorithmic procedures, and artificial intelligence or AI systems is typically a kind of umbrella term that kind of encompasses all of these different elements into a kind of vague, fuzzy, and often quite misleading way of evoking these different aspects. So that's for the definition. Now, what's interesting, of course, is given this importance of algorithms, analytics, AI, and data in our daily lives, these developments have not gone unnoticed. And in fact, there isn't a single week without what I said, media headlines about whether algorithms and analytics are good or bad for people and societies. And so, thinking about these algorithmic debates, basically we can identify two main positions. On the one hand, you have what I call artificial intelligence enthusiasts or advocates, right? And typically these enthusiasts, many of whom are based all around and at Stanford, believes that computational technologies can help rationalize the way in which we do things. And if you look a tiny bit more closely at their arguments, they typically have two versions of this kind of rationalization Weberian argument, so to speak. The first one is an economic argument where really the idea is that algorithms can process more information and make more rational decisions about how to minimize production costs or how to brand a product. So it's really all about efficiency. And then you have a political argument, which is much more about objectivity and accountability. And the idea there is that algorithms can help cure us from long histories of ignorance, bias, and discrimination. They can make us more accountable by providing a neutral recommendation. And this, again, for people who kind of know their history of science, kind of goes back to a couple of centuries ago, and this idea of mechanical objectivity and the benefits of mechanical objectivity over subjective human judgment. So that's the kind of enthusiastic side, right? Of course, the kind of other side of the coin is the critical side. And what over the past 5 years has emerged as the FATE movement, which is one way of describing it, for fairness, accountability, transparency, and ethics. And that's kind of, a range of critics, both academics and activists coming together and making a couple of points about algorithmic systems. The first one being that algorithms are opaque, not only because they're typically proprietary, but also because they rely on complex calculations that most people don't have the skills to understand how they work, and that in the case of machine learning algorithms, they keep changing in ways that even the developers may not be aware of what's going on, right? Second, and perhaps more importantly, algorithms are not neutral. They, in fact, very often and frequently reproduce and reinforces history of bias and oppression. And the main idea here is that, not only do they rely on training data, which is itself skewed and mirrors long histories of social and racial inequality, but that the ways in which the models themselves are designed typically reinforces these forms of historical bias. So that's a kind of like garbage in, garbage out kind of models that, you only get what you put in it and how you analyze what you put in it. And that's typically not great. And finally, that algorithms, far from making people more accountable, in fact contribute to what, for example, Pasquale has called the black box society, right? So typically, because they're opaque and biased, they typically make people and organizations less accountable because no one understands what's going on, and it's impossible to appeal the decisions of algorithmic systems. So now, of course, between the kind of enthusiasts and the critics, there are many important differences, right? And even within these two groups, we could kind of, go into endless decisions between kind of more reformist critics and more abolitionist critics. But here, I want to make a slightly different point, which is that in spite of the many differences between these two sides, the two kind of versions of the debate still share interesting similarities, often, though not always. And the main similarities are first, many of these both kind of enthusiastic praises and critiques focus on the instruments themselves. So there is a lot of attention paid to algorithms themselves and not so much to everything that's around it. Second, there is often a kind of quite high level of abstractions in these critiques, right? So it's like algorithms with a big A everywhere are either really good or really bad, with the kind of process that, the idea is that you can generalize across domains. And finally, and that's kind of my main point, the idea is that, many of these kind of approaches take algorithmic power for granted. So the idea here is that no one is questioning or even exploring what kind of concrete impact these algorithms have on the social world. And here, it's really in a way reinforcing the Silicon Valley kind of myopia according to which, technological innovation necessarily has potent effect on the social world, right? And so I kind of push a bit against this, and obviously I'm not the only one, but here I'm going to talk about my research program, so that's, I'm monopolizing the floor here, about what I've been calling over the past 10 years, algorithms in practice. So in my work, I look at the concrete effects that algorithms have on the ground. In my case, on the professional and work practices of the people affected by technological tools. And I argue several things. First, I take a cultural approach in a way, saying that algorithms function as complex social symbols. They're never just data, just math, just code. They get earmarked and interpreted. They always stand for more complex entities. They're just very complex. Second, and consequently, algorithms can take a variety of meanings. In other words, context matters. And here I really kind of draw on the work of social theorists such as Bourdieu, Scott, and Orlikowski, and their definition of what's been called the logic of practice, which is that people do things in ways that don't always match the intentions of the technocrats who are trying to regulate how people do things, right? So there is a thing called the logic of practice that is kind of hard to perceive from the outside. And finally, and that's kind of the consequence of these two things, that there is very often a gap between the designed and the actual uses of technology and here of algorithms. And here, this is something that very much a central tenet of science and technology studies, and the idea of pushing back against technological determinism, that the uses and meanings of technology are always open, flexible, and kind of negotiated on the ground. And so that's exactly what I look at in my research in the case of algorithms. So in order to explore this question and kind of be like, okay, so we have algorithms, they live around her, we live in a world where there are all of these computational systems. What kind of concrete effects do they have? Well, it's an open question. And so to examine this question, I've been looking over the past 10 years at 3 research sites, the first one being journalism, the second one being criminal justice, and the most recent one being influencers. And so today, I'm going to rush a tiny bit and try to walk you through these 3 different cases, just to give you a sense of how much variation there can be in how people use and make sense of this computational technology. So bear with me, because I'm going to be covering quite a bit of ground, but I think it's, I strongly believe that it's interesting and that kind of compelling findings come out of it. So let me tell you a tiny bit about methods. So, as Giovanna mentioned, I'm an ethnographer, which means that I typically rely on a mix of interviews, observations, and kind of additional methods, either quantitative or content analysis, kind of a mix of things. And I'm happy to talk more about that. And so typically what I've been doing for each of these cases is spending a lot of time with the people who are using these algorithms in their daily work, right? So first, online news, which was my dissertation project, which I did at Princeton at the EHESS in Paris. Then criminal justice, which I mostly did while I was a postdoc at Data and Society in New York. And finally, influencers, which is my new book project, and which I'm writing right now with a great deal of pleasure, because it's just really fascinating. So, again, lots of things we could add here, and I'm happy to talk more about that if there are questions. But now, let me kind of drawing on this data, go briefly about the 3 cases and kind of compare and contrast the effects that algorithms have in these 3 institutional sites. So let me start with online news, which is my first case study, and which is at the center of my book, Metrics at Work, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2020. So, as you certainly know, the news have moved online over the past 30 years. It started in the 1990s, accelerated in the 2000s, and the 2010s in many ways are just the kind of whole online world in which journalists now move. Now, there are many differences between print and television news and online news, but For my purpose, the main kind of interesting difference is just the business model and affordances of digital technologies and how it affects online news production. Most websites, especially in the 2010, and I'm happy to talk more about that, rely on advertising revenue, which is based on traffic numbers and more specifically on the number of unique visitors per month to make a living. Again, that's the case both for websites that rely primarily on advertising revenues and also for websites that use subscriptions. They also rely on advertising revenues. I'm happy to talk more about that. But basically what this means is that starting in the 2010, for the first time, journalists started to get a lot of information about what online users were doing and how they were coming to their websites and spending time on kind of different news articles. And in order to get that data, there was a specific innovation that emerged, which is real-time web analytics software program, which turned into a booming market over the course of the 2010s. So what are web analytics software programs? Well, they typically look like this. So this is Chartbeat. It was the most popular web analytics programs in the 2010s. It's changed a tiny bit. Now there are a couple of competitors and many newsrooms have developed their own web analytics software programs. But what you can see here is that it's typically a dashboard that gives a lot of information about how many readers are on any given website at any given moment. So that's a kind of dial on the left side. Here you see it's around 11,000. You see how long they stay on each page. You have the ranking of the most popular articles. You have a lot of information about where readers are coming from. You can see how long they stay on each page. Here it's 44 seconds, which is a bit depressing, but not unusual. And so basically these kinds of software programs became, over the course of the 2010s, a routine presence in most newsrooms, in the sense that most editors and journalists looked at that information when deciding how to promote specific articles, even deciding what to write, deciding how to reorganize things on the homepage, etc. And so what I decided to study was how journalists were using these software programs, and especially kind of comparing and contrasting how journalists in different sites were using that information. And so in order to do that, I decided to compare several newsrooms in two countries with very different journalistic traditions and relations to the market, namely the United States and France. And so the book ends up comparing two websites that have many similarities that are called The Notebook and Laplace. It's anonymized, who both started using Chartbeat in 2009, 2010. And so there, what I find is a story that, just summarizing very quickly, I call a story of algorithmic ambivalence, in the sense that journalists both kind of fixate on metrics, but also hate them. They both trust them, but they also criticize them. And basically, there is a lot of kind of floating kind of feelings that are attached to and surrounds the case of web analytics software programs and the metrics they provide. And so without spending too much time here, one of the main kind of points that I develop in the book is that, well, first, there is quite a number of significant differences in how journalists in the New York website and the Paris website make sense of these metrics and analytics software programs, in the sense that, for example, in the New York website, editors kind of trust metrics and typically say, well, journalism is a marketplace, and so we need to get information about the market in order to stay competitive. Whereas staff writers in that newsrooms typically engage in passive resistance, saying like, listen, it's not our job. Our job is to write good articles, not to pay attention to traffic numbers. That's the job of top editors. They're getting paid the big bucks. That's their responsibility. Whereas in contrast, at the French website, journalists and editors both strongly criticized metrics, comparing Chartbeat to and the chase for traffic to prostitution. So using a very gendered metaphor, to say the least, comparing the chase for clicks to a kind of degradation, to selling yourself cheap, to, all of these metaphors of sex work that were very interesting because mostly it was white men using them, but also at the same time were deeply fixated on analytic software programs and kept staring at Chartbeat day in, day out. And that's kind of what I noticed during my fieldwork, that they were just like, they kept kind of looking at the screens and looking at the metrics and making jokes about it, etc. And so now, the question that I analyze in the book is like, well, so how can we make sense of these kind of ambivalent attitudes towards web analytics? And kind of the main ideas that I develop in the book is that really journalists see different things in metrics and algorithms. They see market pressures, and as such, they typically resist market pressures and they say, no, this is not what we do. Or if their top editors are like, yeah, this is what we do because we need to survive, and this is a very competitive market, right? But so they see these metrics and algorithms and market pressures, but also as a fuzzy symbol of what I call in the book algorithmic publics. So these very distributed online publics that are brought together and represented through complex algorithmic procedures. And as such, well, they care about metrics because they're a bit like academics, they want to be read. And even more so than academics, they want to be read by a lot of people, right? And this goes back to the idea developed by Bourdieu that journalism is a heteronymous field, meaning it's a field that's deeply characterized by commercial pressures. And as such, I think that it's really this ambivalent attitude of journalists towards both the market and the public that explains this kind of like ambivalence towards web analytics and the software programs that defines them. Okay, so that's the first case. Now let me jump to the second case, which is criminal justice. A very different case, obviously. Let me start with a tiny bit of background on the case of criminal justice. Over the past 30 years, an innovation has spread like wildfire across US criminal courts. This innovation is called risk assessment instruments. And they're software programs that are used to assess quantitatively the risk of recidivism of offenders and defendants, right? And so typically the way it works is that a pretrial officer, who is typically a social worker, either gives a kind of survey to a defendant or like enters the information themselves onto a software program. So it's typically information about the criminal record of the defendant, about their kind of some about their social history, whether they have a history of drug abuse, whether they have a history of failing to appear in court, whether it's a violent offense, like a whole range of variables. And then typically they kind of click on a button that says calculate risk, and then you get an output page that looks like the one I screenshotted and put on the screen, where you have a scale from 1 to 10. A risk score of 1 means that you're low risk, and typically the software programs then will recommend release, right? Typically at the pretrial stage. A 10 score means that you're high risk, and typically in that case, the software program will recommend incarceration. One way or another. Then there are like lots of different nuances, different kinds of risk scores that are being calculated. You can see that on the left. Now, what's interesting about these predictive instruments is that first, they're everywhere. There are more than 60 of them that are currently being used in the US. They're also used in Canada, in the UK, in Australia, all over Europe. Most criminal courts in the countries use several of them, and they're just absolutely just everywhere. It's like, it's like almost, it's very hard actually to just map how many of them are being used in any given place. The second kind of interesting thing is that this is, in fact, not a completely new development. There is a longer history to this that goes back to the 1930s and then the 1970s. But let's just say that there has been a new kind of movement towards risk assessment tools with the development of big data and machine learning algorithms. And so we just see much more of this. We have seen much more of this over the past 10 years. And the third aspect, which, in so many ways is the most important aspect, is that these kind of risk assessment tools are currently at the center of a very heated debate about whether they're good or bad with respect to racial justice, racial equity, and reforming criminal justice at an age of mass incarceration. And so to go very quickly, for the defenders, and so again, the enthusiasts, right, who thinks that technology can save us, the idea here is that by using these algorithms, we can cure the criminal justice system by providing more objective, neutral, and efficient decision-making guidelines than kind of the traditional discretionary judgments of judges and prosecutors, which we know is typically very much biased, especially against young African-American men. In contrast, a lot of critics over the past 5 years have delineated how these algorithms, because they use historical data, because they use data that has been produced by a very unfair and biased criminal justice system, in fact, reproduce that very bias and specifically are biased against Blacks. So the idea is that, I'm not getting too much into the details here, but for a similar level of risk, the software program is much more likely to give a high risk to Black men who end up not, in fact, engaging in recidivism compared to white men who similarly do not end up, in fact, engaging in recidivism. And here, I strongly recommend reading this article by Julia Engwing and her team, where they did a big computational analysis using FOIA requests of how the algorithms are biased. Of course, the problem is that then a lot of pushback happened, criticizing their methods and basically finding that it's impossible to develop an unbiased algorithm in the case of criminal justice. I encourage anyone who's interested in these questions to take my class on politics of algorithms, where we get into the details of all of this. So heated debate about bias versus like saving criminal justice, curing criminal justice, etc. And yet in all of this, very few studies, very few empirical studies of how these algorithms are concretely used in criminal courts in the US. And so that's what I decided to study, in part because before coming to the US, I had done field work and published a book about criminal sentencing in a courthouse in France. And so that's like a topic that I care about a lot and have been caring a lot about for the past 15 years. And so I went to do fieldwork in several criminal courts in the US, one in the South, one on the East Coast, and one on the West Coast, and kind of asking judges and prosecutors about how they use risk assessment tools, what do they think about it, and then following them in their daily kind of routines, from the kind of back chambers to the hearings and the kind of criminal courts to the negotiations with the prosecutors, etc., and kind of trying to get a clear sense of how they use risk assessment tools and what happens there. And so again, kind of zooming out from the details of this, and I'm happy to talk more about the kind of fine-grained kind of aspects of the findings, but basically the main story there is really one that I've been calling algorithmic resistance, in the sense that judges and prosecutors in the different courts that I studied did typically not really follow the recommendations of risk assessment tools. They were very critical of these tools, saying, listen, we don't know where they come from, we don't know why we're supposed to use them, we don't understand how they're being built, we don't understand where the data comes from, and by the way, we've read the ProPublica article, and it seems like they're biased against Blacks, which, it seems like we shouldn't be using them if we're trying to reform criminal justice. That just doesn't quite add up. And so what I found and what I kind of wrote and published in several articles is several processes of decoupling and buffering, right? Where judges and prosecutors typically distance themselves from risk assessment tools, typically by not using them, right? So I'm happy to talk more about that. But typically during the hearings, no one mentioned risk scores. They were never kind of brought up during the discussions. And more generally, judges and prosecutors were very critical, saying like, listen, I prefer to trust my own judgment. I know how to read a file. I know how to ask questions to a defendant, and I prefer to kind of rely on that clinical judgment rather than on the kind of black box kind of recommendations of an algorithmic system that I don't understand. Second thing that I found is that discretionary power switched to less accountable places in the criminal justice procedure, in the sense that if judges and prosecutors did not use risk assessment tools, pre-trial departments and technology teams did use them. And in using them, they were very aware that there were easy ways in which they could manipulate these tools and kind of switch some variables, which were a bit more subjective than others, in order to get the risk score for the defendants that they thought the defendant deserved, right? So subjectivity was not erased at all. Instead, it just moved to another place that was less visible in the criminal justice process. And then, in trying to make sense of these findings, I went back to Judith Clark's traditional work on this idea of legalism, right? And in trying to make sense of how the criminal justice system works. And here, we can really go back to this idea that judges and prosecutors deeply care about the rule of the precedent. And as such, they're extremely opposed, for good reasons, to any kind of innovation, especially technological innovation, for which they have zero trust and zero incentive to engage in. So there was basically this strong professional pushback against using algorithms to kind of change the way in which they were doing this, right? Like a strong distrust of innovation and kind of no incentives for kind of, hopping on the bandwagon from that. So that's where I think this idea of algorithmic resistance really comes from a very kind of professional norm, strongly rooted professional norms within the legal professions against innovation and against kind of automated judgments more specifically. Okay, so now let me jump into my third and last case, which is the case of influencers. So influencers, it's, kind of vague and fuzzy term that basically refers to people who seek to make a living through the production and monetization of pictures, text, videos, and sponsored content on social media platforms such as YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and so on. Now, typically, when we read media headlines about influencers, they will be described as, blonde women posting inspirational quotes and sitting gracefully in front of a tasteful kind of office while promoting some kind of product that, we should be all buying and, giving this kind of inspirational quotes like life is either a daring adventure or nothing at all. Typically, that's the kind of depictions that you'll see in social media, in traditional media, saying this is not that important, it's not very serious, and it's kind of shady all over. Influencers typically get a pretty bad press, but we need to take them seriously, and that's what I do in this project. In particular, I'm taking their economic activities very seriously. Indeed, what most people may not be realizing is that influencing is right now a very hot economic bubble under the term typically creator economy and influencer marketing, which I'm happy to talk about. But basically the idea is that, especially with the pandemic, we buy more and more stuff online. Many people have ad blockers, which means that, we are less receptive to online ads. And so what's the bypass for this? Well, it's to follow influencers and to kind of, follow what they tell us about hey, you should really drink San Pellegrino. It's amazing, especially when you talk a lot, like what I'm doing right now. It's really the best produce, the best product that you should get. And by the way, click on this link and you'll get 5% off your first purchase, right? So a kind of booming market where brands are kind of paying influencers to promote their product. And it's just a growing ecosystem. So over the past 2 years, I've been doing fieldwork and interviews, internships and quantitative analysis, observations, and a whole range of online kind of activities with influencers across platforms. And based on that data, basically the main stories that I'm finding here is a story that I call algorithmic dependency. And so the best way of describing it is for, social media influencing and social media creation is completely created and mediated through social media platforms, right? It's a world that did not exist as such 20 years ago. It's a reconfiguration of kind of celebrity culture, branding and marketing, and kind of video culture and gaming. I'm happy to get into all the different kinds of industries and subfields that went into creating that new kind of landscape. But what's really interesting there is that the level of dependency that influencers have with respect to social media platforms is huge. They spend their days on social media platforms. They're making a living through their production on social media platforms, and they completely depend on these platforms in order to continue making a living in the near future. Consequently, due to the centrality of social media platforms in the kind of daily routines and representations of influencers, what I find is that new forms of structuration and institutionalization take place. And again, here, I realize that I took like a traditional sociologist, but think about the Fordist firm. That's kind of what I have in mind in my background. Here, it's very different. And it's different in several ways. But the two main ways is that first, influencers absolutely need to be visible online. They have this imperative to be visible, right? And visibility in turn is measured through metrics. So it's like typically the number of followers, subscribers, views, comments, likes, retweets, whatever, like all of these metrics that are promoted by social media platforms. Second, because they absolutely need to be visible in order to make a living, both through ad revenues and sponsored content that they do for brands, influencers completely depend on the algorithms that are being used and implemented by social media platforms. And these are three kinds of algorithms: curation algorithms, recommendation algorithms, and demonetization algorithms. And I'm happy to talk more about the kind of nitty-gritty differences between all of these. But let's just say as a summary that without that influencers need to please these different kinds of algorithms in order to make a living. And so in so many ways, they work for an algorithmic boss, even though they all kind of completely engaged in a kind of neoliberal kind of self-branding, kind of entrepreneurial logic, where they're like, yeah, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm like a startup, I'm doing what Silicon Valley startups do. So they have a very strong discourse of entrepreneurialism. Finally, I think that due to this kind of omnipresence and this imperative to be visible, and also the dependencies that they have with respect to social media platforms algorithms, influencers are constantly engaged in this kind of discourses of suspicion and resentment against the opacity and accountability and the fact that the algorithms are constantly changing. And so what I find in my fieldwork is the many different ramifications of this suspicion and resentment. For example, the fact that influencers very often have strong conspiracy theories about why platforms are discriminating against them. And again, it's, I call them conspiracy theories, but to be completely honest, we don't really know what the algorithms are doing. So they may very well be, in fact, accurate accounts of what's happening on the platform side, right? But basically that there is a whole world of representations and conspiratorial kind of content and suspicion and resentment that's flourishing against this kind of like unaccountable, opaque, and unresponsive boss that is the algorithm, on which they depend to make a living from 1 week to the next. And so that's what I call algorithmic dependency. So now I'm going to conclude, and going back to the way in which I started this presentation, it seems like it was a long time ago, and perhaps it was, against the rhetoric of algorithmic power, right, and algorithmic determinism. I've argued that I promote a kind of research program that's about algorithms in practice. And specifically about the ways in which people use and make sense of algorithms in ways that are messy and complicated and very much shaped by the structural constraints of the sites within which they operate, right? So typically, again, sociological background coming back, but the kind of professional norms, the organizational kind of constraints, the field structures, the national cultures, all of this stuff really shapes the way in which they understand algorithms and metrics and the way in which they put them in practice. Second, I've argued that, in addition to kind of criticizing the instruments themselves, which is obviously a very important aspect of how to engage with algorithmic system, it's also really important to look at the effects of this site, the effect of these systems through ethnographic studies. And I've proposed a kind of multi-sited ethnographic methods to map the kind of variation and difference between how people use and make sense of these systems, and typically by looking at journalism, criminal justice, and influencers, differentiating between this idea of algorithmic ambivalence, resistance, and dependency. I think these reactions are very much shaped by the structures within which people kind of interact with algorithms, and also obviously the algorithms themselves. To conclude, perhaps two last points, that kind of I hope will be relevant for people in the audience. The first one is that, obviously at a time when computational technologies are everywhere, there is a strong push towards using them as a method, right? And kind of the move towards obviously digital humanities is one thing, but computational social science, computational everything, we should all use big data, we should all do that. And, that's also the main way to get funding and all of that. And I think that's obviously very important and valuable. And I'm not minimizing the great benefits that can come from using computational technologies as a method. But I also think as an ethnographer and as a critical scholar more generally, that in order to have a kind of reasoned understanding of these computational technologies, we also need to study them as an object, right? And as something that itself needs to be unpacked, and that we have the toolkit to unpack through typically social science and kind of humanities training. And finally, I'll finish with the last note, which is, who gets to talk about artificial intelligence? And again, I think that here, a lot of the discourse is monopolized in a way by computer science and kind of technocratic approach, right? Where it's really the kind of traditional view from nowhere, where, you can make abstract, generalizable findings that apply across domain. And that's really the logic that got us to the current place, right, in so many ways. And it's often replicated in the critiques that we make about these technologies. And so in my work, I try to take another angle, which is that context profoundly matters, that we need to focus on people who are using these technologies. And so in this case, the workers and organizations that are being affected and are very much part and parcel of this process of technological change. And here, obviously, this is very much inspired by both feminist theory and critical race theory, kind of using ethnographic methods as a form of situated knowledge where we can get a different perspective on what it is that's happening when artificial intelligence and computational technologies enter the picture. And so perhaps that's not such a bad way to conclude. And so that's it.